Lagos dawn opened like a hymn, soft at first, then rising with engines, vendors, and impatient horns, until the whole city seemed to hum in one bass note. In Edward's mansion, the light arrived through glass, so tall it made morning look expensive. Marble floors remembered every footstep. Two fountains talked to each other across a courtyard of white stone. Edward loved this soundscape, the hush of money. He moved through it like a king, cufflinks glinting, wristwatch heavy enough to mark his rank on his skin. He wanted a wife who glowed the same way, diamond laugh, designer vowels, a halo of important people learning to love him louder. Instead, he had Nina, quiet as a prayer somebody kept forgetting to say out loud. She was not drab, no, she was water where he preferred champagne. The Ankara dresses she chose were well cut and clean, tied with the careful pride of a woman who still ironed her hope flat and smooth before wearing it. She could fill a room without raising her voice, but Edward always felt that her light asked nothing of anyone. And to him, that was its flaw. He wanted spectacle, not steadiness. He wanted applause, not agreement. Ambition, he told her, buttering his toast as though he were gilding it, is the only real perfume. Nina smiled, poured him tea, and answered nothing. She had learned that silence can be a ceiling and a shelter at once. On Sundays, when church bells braided themselves into the city's noise, Nina's face softened the way soil softens under rain. In the pew, she sat straight, hands folded like stitched leaves, a small woman made vast by attention to something higher. Edward sat beside her, but not with her, scrolling through his phone between hymns, calculating the number of deals a man could close while other men wasted time singing. When people greeted them after service, Sister Nina, God bless you. Brother Edward, good morning, sir. He measured the fabrics and watches and weighed every moment of their marriage against what it did to his reputation. It galled him that his wife's grace drew gentle eyes, not hungry ones. He wanted the kind that crowed and circled. The breaking began small, as splinters do, when Sister Miriam hugged Nina after service and said, "You look beautiful, my dear," in the warm way old women give blessings that double as courage. Edward smiled the public smile he wore like cologne, but the compliment bruised him in a place only he could feel. In the car, the air conditioning was cold enough to fog the window edges. "Beautiful," he repeated, tasting the word as if it had expired. "In that, you don't rise, Nina. You never rise." She looked out at the slow river of buses and hawkers and thought about how rivers rise without shouting. "I like my life simple," she said softly. "I like it clean." "Simple is the costume of the unambitious," he answered, and the word unambitious landed between them like a glass dropped from high. At home, dinner waited under silver domes like secret moons. Edward removed the lids with a flourish, then ate with the impatience of a man auditioning for power. He spoke of men whose wives announced them when they entered any room, of women who were billboards, mirrors, museums. "You," he said, "remove noise from my life. I need someone who creates it." He emptied a glass, refilled it, and emptied it again. Nina's hands remained still on her lap, morning's him already far away. When she stood to clear the plates, a wave of anger, quick and hot, broke over his face. He left the table, came back with her suitcase, and set it on the chair like a verdict. The money arrived last. 3 $50 notes slapped onto the polished wood, a sound sharp enough to startle her heartbeat into a sprint. "Take this," he said, voice smooth as marble steps. "Compensation for wasted years." The notes lay there, green and smug, as if currency had learned to smirk. Nina watched her old life narrow to the size of a handle and a hinge. She wanted to remind him of nights they shared a mattress, with ambition no larger than a ceiling fan, of how her mother's bracelets had melted into the down payment on his first office, of prayers whispered over broken deals until they mended. Instead, she folded her stillness around herself like a shawl, took the suitcase, gathered the money, refusing to let mockery glue to her fingers, and walked out into a night that had room for her. Outside, the air tasted of rain. Somewhere far off, thunder rehearsed. The motel had a corridor that smelled like wet cement and old soap, and a ceiling fan that turned like a tired prophecy. The receptionist slid a key across the counter with the indifference of someone who has seen many endings, and Nina climbed the stairs to a room the color of unripe pawpaw. She set the suitcase down gently, as if it contained a sleeping child, then sat on the edge of the bed and opened her palm. 3 notes stared up at her like questions. Is this all your life is worth? What can a woman build with this? What does dignity cost per night? She laughed, the brittle, surprised laugh of a person who steps into a puddle and finds a river, and then the laugh broke into tears. The pillow listened without judging, as pillows do. She did not call anyone. Solitude, when it is new, is a room with all the furniture on the wrong wall. She moved things in her mind, one by one. A list formed, food first, then a second-hand phone line, then a plan that didn't press against her soul, like a shoe a size too small. She remembered her mother saying, "When God is quiet, the next sentence will be important." So, she waited for the sentence. It came oddly, a small memory of standing in a shop once, watching a woman scratch a lottery ticket with a coin and laugh like a church bell when she won enough to pay a semester's fees. Nina considered it not as magic, but as a kind of dare, a private rebellion against the script Edward wrote for her. The next morning, Lagos had already tied its headscarf and gone to work. Nina bought hot bread wrapped in yesterday's headlines, and a warm sachet of milk from a girl with bright, reliable eyes. She ate on a low wall under an almond tree that made its own shade with unhurried generosity. With careful fingers, she separated one $50 note from the others and slid it back into her purse. The remaining bills felt heavier now, as if they were aware of their destiny. Midweek service was that evening, and she felt a pull in her chest, a tug toward the only place her name had ever sounded bigger than her circumstances. She would go to church. She would sit where hope sounded like a choir. She would ask God for a sentence long enough to shelter her. The church's midweek prayers gathered the cities, tired, into a bowl of light. Ceiling fans spun scripture into the air. Voices rose and fell like tides nurses learn to predict by instinct. Nina sat low in the pew, hands clasped, the words of the pastor threading through her like a bomb. "We are not what was done to us," he said gently. "We are what we decide with what remains." She felt the truth of it bloom behind her ribs. During testimony time, a mechanic in oil-stained overalls spoke of a debt canceled unexpectedly, and the congregation clapped with the relief of people hungry for good news. When the last amen uncoiled into the night, she stayed seated a while longer, letting quiet finish its work. Outside, the compound's bulbs drew a circle of moths and murmurs. The kiosk by the gate was a tiny country of its own. Biscuits stacked like bricks, bottled drinks dressed in condensation, airtime cards that promised connection in neat rectangles. Behind a small glass, a lottery terminal blinked with the sleepy patience of machines that know the world will spin back to them. Nina stood there, 3 notes in her purse, a prayer in her mouth. "Auntie," the vendor said, smiling, "try your luck today?" The words might have offended her on another night. Now they felt like a page turned. She took 1 note out, 1, not both, and laid it on the counter. "1 ticket," she said, and the machine sang its small song while paper warmed in its throat. She held the slip like a seed, not a miracle, something to be planted, watered, left alone in faith and good soil. She did not imagine mansions or silk or the sudden applause of people who had not clapped before. She imagined a door opening at the right time because she had knocked with the right knuckles. On the walk back to the motel, the city's noise wrapped around her like an untidy shawl. Danfo conductors auditioning for the role of thunder, generators droning their permanent lullaby, laughter spilling out of a buka fragrant with pepper and relief. Nina lifted her face to a reluctant wind and whispered, "Let my ashes know rain." The ticket rested against her heart, light as paper, heavy as a promise she was finally brave enough to ask for. The morning came without ceremony. Sunlight peeled its way through the thin motel curtains, warm and ordinary, as if nothing had shifted in the universe. Nina brewed tea on the rusted electric coil, sipping it while the world outside muttered in its usual keys. hawkers singing wares, buses coughing smoke, and impatient drivers banging horns like stubborn drummers. The radio on the bedside table spoke of politics, then shifted into the lottery draw. She almost ignored it, half listening, her ticket tucked carelessly between the pages of her Bible, where she had left it the night before. Numbers rolled off the announcer's tongue like marbles, falling one by one, and her ears pricked. She leaned forward, frowning, her hand trembling as she pulled out the slip. One number matched, then another, and another, until the entire row glowed alive before her eyes. Her breath caught. The tea slid down her throat like sandpaper. The room spun, its paint peeling, its fan whirring in disbelief. She read the numbers again, then again, and the page of her Bible behind it blurred with sudden tears. $15 million, the announcer said cheerfully, and Nina dropped the cup. It shattered, spilling a small flood across the floor. She pressed both hands against her chest, afraid her heart might tear itself free. The motel walls seemed to shrink and grow in waves, like the inside of a dream. She fell to her knees, sobbing into the bedspread, every insult Edward had ever spat at her replaying in her ears. But now they sounded like brittle sticks breaking one after the other. For hours she sat there, alternating between laughter and disbelief, tears and whispered prayers. She thought of her late mother, whose bracelets had once turned into cash for Edward's office. She thought of all the nights she cooked dinner in silence, watching Edward chase ambition with other women, his pride always louder than his promises. Now, the God she had clung to in secret had answered, not with just survival, but with abundance. She kissed the ticket, lifted her eyes, and said softly, "You make tables in the wilderness." It wasn't just money, it was vindication, a rebirth carved from ashes. The days that followed were a storm hidden in still air. Nina told no one except Samuel, her cousin, a young lawyer with sharp eyes and loyalty tempered by blood. He came to her in the motel with his laptop, stacks of documents, and a seriousness that wrapped the room in gravity. "We must be wise," he said, his fingers dancing across keys like a pianist scoring her future. He advised against noise, against drawing attention, against the kind of flamboyance Edward had always worshipped. Nina nodded, grateful, because she had no taste for spectacle anyway. They opened discreet accounts, routed the winnings through layers of protection, and registered a small company in her name. Samuel spoke of investments, of real estate, of stocks and bonds. Nina listened, overwhelmed at first, then fascinated. She had once thought herself unambitious because she didn't hunger for the stage lights Edward craved. But here was another kind of ambition, quiet, deliberate, building foundations instead of fireworks. She chose carefully, pouring money into ventures that would grow without parading. Samuel smiled at her choices, realizing she had the instinct Edward claimed she lacked. "You've always had wisdom," he told her one night, "just not the kind that impresses shallow men." Those words curled inside her like balm, undoing knots she had carried for years. By the week's end, Nina had moved into a new apartment in Akoi, not a sprawling palace, but a high-rise with tasteful marble, soft lighting, and a view of the lagoon. Her neighbors were discreet professionals, not gossip mongers. She filled the rooms with books, framed scriptures, and plants that reached for the sun. The wardrobe in her new closet glowed with elegant fabrics, silk, lace, but modestly cut, the kind that announced grace without begging for applause. She didn't plan to return to Edward's world. She was building one where she could breathe. Transformation came not in one thunderclap, but in the rhythm of small choices. Each morning, Nina rose before dawn, prayed by her window overlooking the city's stirring lights, and reminded herself that wealth was not permission to forget humility. She enrolled in etiquette and speech classes, not to impress Edward's circle, but to strengthen the confidence she knew she would need in boardrooms and negotiations. She visited tailors who sewed gowns that flowed with her dignity, garments that spoke of self-respect rather than borrowed splendor. Slowly, her reflection began to change, not just in fabric and poise, but in the fire of her eyes, in the way she carried silence like an instrument she finally knew how to play. Her first public appearance with her new life came at church. She walked into the sanctuary one Sunday, her head high, her gown whispering with elegance, her Bible tucked firmly under her arm. Congregants turned, whispered, and smiled in surprise. It was the same Nina they had known, but also not the same, like a hymn they'd sung all their lives, suddenly accompanied by a full orchestra. Sister Miriam clasped her hand, saying, "God has lifted you, my dear," and Nina smiled through tears. She sang louder than usual that day, her voice clear, not for Edward or anyone else, but for the God who had rewritten her story. The whispers spread through the pews, and by the time service ended, the courtyard buzzed with the news. "Have you seen Nina? She is glowing. Her life has changed." Edward, who sat in a different section, heard them all. He turned, eyes narrowing, and there she was, walking toward her car, radiant, composed, untouchable. It wasn't the car that stunned him, nor the gown, nor even the subtle jewelry. It was the confidence, the quiet authority that no amount of money could buy. For the first time in years, Edward felt smaller. Edward drove home that Sunday with silence roaring in his ears. The engine hummed, the leather seats creaked under his shifting weight, but his thoughts drowned it all out. He could not reconcile what he had seen. Nina, the same woman he had once mocked for being too plain, too small for his empire, had blossomed into a vision that commanded respect. The congregation's whispers were arrows. Each one pierced his pride. He remembered the way people used to laugh at her simplicity, how his friends snickered behind his back that his wife lacked polish. Now those same eyes had followed her like bees after nectar. At home, he paced the marble floor, pouring drink after drink, searching for a justification. Maybe it was luck, maybe she had found a benefactor, maybe this glow was borrowed. He refused to believe it could be hers, truly hers. But a seed of fear gnawed at him. What if it was? What if Nina, the woman he dismissed, now walked a road brighter than his? His ego recoiled at the thought, yet his curiosity thickened. He began to ask discreet questions, calling acquaintances who attended the same church, probing for answers. Whispers returned. Nina had struck fortune. Nina was investing. Nina was blossoming on her own. The discovery burned. Edward's pride was not in losing her. It was in the idea that she had risen without him. He had built his empire with sweat and calculation, believing himself the architect of destiny. To imagine Nina achieving wealth and grace without his hand felt like betrayal against the natural order he had crafted in his head. "She should not have," he muttered, gripping his glass until it threatened to shatter. And yet, beneath the anger, another thought slithered in. Perhaps he could still claim her, reclaim what was his, not out of love, but possession. He resolved that the next Sunday, he would not just watch, he would speak. The next Sunday, Edward dressed as though he were preparing for battle. His suit was freshly pressed, his cufflinks gleamed like twin suns, and his cologne lingered in the air long after he left a room. He walked into church not for God, not for prayer, but for performance. His eyes scanned the pews like a hawk tracing the horizon. And then there she was. Nina sat with Sister Miriam, her head bowed in worship, her voice rising with the choir, untouched by the noise of speculation around her. Edward felt a strange tug, not of love, but of possession, as though the woman singing was still his to command. When service ended, he positioned himself near the courtyard exit, leaning casually against his car, as though fate had arranged the meeting. When Nina approached, the whispers around her carried like incense. She had chosen a cream-colored lace gown, simple yet regal, her head wrapped in matching fabric that caught the sun. Edward forced a smile, broad and rehearsed. "Nina," he called, his voice carrying a false warmth. She paused, surprised, then nodded politely. "Edward." Her tone was measured, neither bitter nor soft, the kind of tone that places a fence around a heart. He reached for small talk, how she had been, how radiant she looked, how church had missed her. Nina listened, eyes calm, lips curved in the barest courtesy. Not once did she give him the satisfaction of nostalgia. The conversation lasted barely 3 minutes, but Edward walked away unsettled. He had expected tears, perhaps resentment, perhaps even relief. Instead, he encountered something more dangerous: indifference. Nina did not look like a woman wounded, nor a woman waiting. She looked like a woman who had built a new rhythm, one where he was no longer conductor. The thought lodged in his chest like a stone, and all the way home, his mind replayed her calm, polite distance. Indifference, he realized, was the cruelest revenge. That night, Edward sat in his study, a fortress of leather chairs, mahogany shelves, and whiskey that flowed like truth serum. He poured himself a glass, swirling it until the amber liquid caught the lamplight, and debated with himself. Pride and desire wrestled like two lions in his chest. One voice insisted, "Leave her. You threw her away. Find another, one with status, with glitter." The other voice countered, "No, reclaim her. Prove she cannot live without you. Bring her back into your orbit." Both voices came from the same place, ego, not love. Edward did not crave Nina's heart. He craved the victory of ownership. He imagined walking into church with her on his arm again, the congregation buzzing with envy, men whispering, "Edward is truly a man of stature." The thought pleased him. Yet another image slithered in: Clarissa. She was young, elegant, already moving in elite circles. She had the beauty of a cover model and the boldness of someone who knew her worth in carats. Clarissa would look perfect beside him, dazzling, ambitious, someone who understood the theater of wealth. She was, in many ways, the wife he had always claimed to deserve. But Clarissa also demanded, negotiated, and reminded him that her loyalty was a transaction. Unlike Nina, she would not soften for him. Edward tapped the glass against the desk, frowning. His pride longed to prove to Nina that she had made a mistake by living without him, that her independence was just borrowed light. But Clarissa represented the world he wanted to flaunt, flashy, extravagant, loud. Caught between the two, he decided on a strategy as old as deceit: try both. If Nina resisted, Clarissa would be his weapon. If Clarissa proved troublesome, Nina's humility would be his backup prize. He leaned back in his chair, smug, as though the world were still a chessboard he controlled. The following weeks turned Edward into a performer draped in false humility. He began arriving early at church, sitting in pews near Nina, bowing his head more dramatically during prayers, and even lifting his hands during worship with the exaggerated piety of a man who thought God was watching his theatrics. After service, he made sure to be seen greeting elders warmly, speaking of second chances and the grace of forgiveness. His words were sharp with rehearsed repentance, but his eyes betrayed the hunger of conquest. One Sunday, he approached Nina directly after the benediction. With a bouquet of roses in hand and a smile stretched wider than sincerity could manage, he said, "Nina, I was a fool. I let pride destroy what God blessed me with. Can you find it in your heart to forgive me?" The crowd around them hummed with curiosity, ears craning for her response. Nina accepted the flowers with a calm smile, thanked him softly, and turned to walk away. She did not argue, did not accuse, did not shout. Her silence cut deeper than rejection. Edward stood there, bouquetless, with murmurs rising around him like smoke. At home, Edward seethed. "She thinks she can mock me with her calmness," he muttered, pacing the living room. He had expected tears, or perhaps a trembling smile of reconciliation. Instead, she had offered nothing, and it stung worse than contempt. Still, he was not deterred. If flowers and apologies would not bend her, he would try pressure, persistence, anything. To Edward, women were doors, and all doors in his mind opened eventually, if one had the right key or the right force. But Edward was not a man who placed all his bets on one number. While he staged his charade of repentance at church, he also entertained Clarissa in expensive restaurants and lounges. Clarissa was everything Nina was not: flamboyant, glittering, a woman who spoke in brands and walked as if the world were a runway. Edward liked the way she attracted eyes in public, the way waiters leaned forward, the way men glanced twice. She made him feel amplified. Yet, beneath the sparkle, Clarissa carried steel. She demanded trips, gifts, and promises. She reminded Edward that she had other suitors, men just as wealthy, and that her loyalty was earned, not assumed. Edward told himself this was what he wanted: a woman who was as much an asset as a companion, a billboard of his status. But in quiet moments, when Clarissa's laughter echoed too loudly in his ears, he found himself remembering Nina's silence, the silence that had once irritated him, but now haunted him like a song he couldn't forget. Clarissa was glamorous, yes, but she was also exhausting. Nina had been soft, yielding, almost invisible at times, but now that invisibility had transformed into something else. Dignity. And dignity, Edward discovered, was harder to control than arrogance. He juggled them both, flowers and apologies for Nina, diamonds and dinners for Clarissa, thinking he was the puppeteer. Yet, in truth, both women had slipped the strings. Nina owed him nothing, and Clarissa was using him as a stepping stone. But Edward, blinded by ego, did not see it. In his mind, he still believed the game was his to win. What he did not know was that both paths, Nina's refusal and Clarissa's demands, were slowly weaving into a net that would one day catch him. By the third Sunday of Edward's charade, the mask began to slip. He could not stand another week of Nina smiling politely, of her refusing to grant him the drama he so desperately craved. That morning, after service, he intercepted her in the courtyard. The congregation was dispersing in waves of laughter and conversation, but Edward's voice cut sharp through the air. "Nina," he said firmly, blocking her path, "are you going to keep ignoring me? After everything I built for you?" She turned, her Bible still in her hand, her eyes calm as the surface of a deep river. "I'm not ignoring you, Edward," she said softly. "I just don't belong to your world anymore." The words stung like a whip. "Don't belong," he repeated, his voice rising. "Everything you are, everything you have, was possible because of me. Do you think you'd even have the money to play that lottery without me? Do you think you'd be walking in silk if I hadn't given you a taste of wealth?" His anger began to gather stares from those still lingering nearby. Nina didn't flinch. She looked at him steadily, her silence louder than his accusations. Then, with a small, deliberate smile, she said, "You're right about one thing. The night you threw me out, you gave me something. The money you meant to insult me with became my seed of freedom. You gave me the key to escape you." Edward's mouth went dry. Around them, murmurs grew. Heads turned. The embarrassment was a hot coal in his chest. He had come to reclaim control, but instead, Nina had turned his own insult into her triumph. He stormed away, his car door slamming like a gavel. Inside, his hands shook as he gripped the wheel. "She will not mock me," he hissed. "I'll remind her who the real architect of her fortune is." That was the moment the lawsuit took root in his mind, not as justice, but as revenge. The following week, Edward gathered his legal team in his private office. The room was lined with glass awards and framed photographs of groundbreaking ceremonies where he had cut ribbons beside governors. He paced before them like a general planning war. "Gentlemen," he began, "my ex-wife has come into a fortune made possible because of my money. I want 70% of it." The lawyers exchanged glances, some skeptical, others intrigued. One finally spoke. "On what grounds, sir?" Edward smirked. "On the grounds that the money used to buy that ticket was mine. Without me, she had nothing. Legally, that's my seed money. Morally, it's my right." They began drafting arguments, weaving narratives that painted Nina as a dependent woman who had merely stumbled into luck. They would portray Edward as the benefactor, the provider whose generosity had directly birthed her winnings. Edward watched them work, savoring the picture. Nina cornered in court, forced to acknowledge him, her independence stripped back to the shadows where he thought she belonged. In his mind, this was more than money. It was reclaiming the dominance she had dared to defy. Meanwhile, word of the case leaked into the community. Newspapers and online blogs feasted on the story. Millionaire husband demands 70% of ex-wife's lottery winnings. Radio hosts debated it, congregants whispered it in pews, and strangers argued over it in traffic. Some said Edward was right. After all, hadn't he given her the money? Others defended Nina fiercely, calling her fortune divine justice, a testimony of God lifting the humble. The story spread like dry harmattan fire, and suddenly Nina was no longer just a woman with winnings. She was a symbol. At church, Nina felt the weight of stares. Some smiled, whispering blessings, telling her she was a living testimony. Others eyed her with suspicion, murmuring that she was ungrateful, that she owed Edward her new life. It was as if the pews had split in two, those who saw her as God's favored daughter, and those who saw her as a runaway wife trying to erase her benefactor. She walked through the aisle with dignity, her head lifted, but inside, the tension pressed against her ribs like an iron band. Edward, on the other hand, relished the attention. He began walking into church with exaggerated confidence, Clarissa sometimes on his arm, glittering like a trophy. To him, the whispers were fuel. He posed as the wronged husband, sighing in strategic corners, telling anyone who would listen that Nina had betrayed him, that she was rewriting history at his expense. He would sit in front pews, loudly praying for justice, his voice swelling during intercessions so all could hear. The frenzy spread beyond the church. Journalists parked outside the courthouse, cameras clicking as Nina stepped in with Samuel at her side, her simple gowns now paired with quiet strength. Edward arrived in convoys, Clarissa waving like a queen. Commentators on television turned the trial into entertainment. Is Edward entitled to her winnings? Should a husband benefit from his wife's luck? The public was divided, and the trial had yet to even begin. Nina watched it all unfold, her faith her only anchor. Samuel warned Nina that Edward's lawyers would paint her as small, dependent, and unworthy of her winnings. They'll try to erase your story, he said. They'll try to make you invisible again. Nina nodded, her heart heavy but resolute. She went back into her memories, searching for strength in old wounds. She remembered nights Edward belittled her for not wearing designer gowns, days he called her too plain to be the wife of a mogul, and the final night he flung her dignity across the floor with those bills. She gathered those memories like stones for a sling. She also unearthed proof, receipts of her late mother's jewelry she had sold to support Edward's first venture, notes she had kept from family loans she secured to back him. These were her reminders that she had given more than he ever acknowledged. She began writing her testimony, not just for the court, but for herself, a map of her journey from insult to independence. Each sentence was a wound turned scar, each scar a chapter of survival. At night, Nina prayed not just for victory, but for clarity. She knew Edward's wealth meant he could drag this fight endlessly, but she refused to let him define her story. Lord, she whispered in the quiet of her new home, if this battle is mine to fight, let me fight with dignity. And if this victory is mine to keep, let the world know it was you, not him, who lifted me. Her tears dampened the pillow, but when she slept, she dreamed of light, warm, unwavering, and untouchable. The courtroom was a stage, and Edward entered like a man certain he was the lead actor. Cameras flashed as he strode in wearing a tailored suit dark as midnight, Clarissa on his arm like a sequined exclamation mark. He smirked when he saw Nina already seated, her hands folded on her lap, her gown modest yet regal. She had no entourage, no designer shade of arrogance, just Samuel beside her, steady as a pillar. Yet her calm unsettled him more than the judge's gavel could. When proceedings began, Edward's lawyers attacked quickly, painting Nina as a housewife who contributed nothing, who had no dreams of her own, who would have starved without Edward's generosity. They called her a dependent, an ornament, a woman plucked from obscurity by her husband's wealth. Edward listened with satisfaction, his chin lifted proudly. Every word from his lawyers fed his ego like wine, convincing him that the case was already won. He stole glances at Nina, expecting her to flinch, expecting her to crumble under the weight of their accusations. But she sat upright, her face serene, as though their words were arrows striking a shield she had carried long before this day. Her silence was defiance, her poise a testimony. It infuriated Edward. He wanted her to break. He wanted tears, trembling, regret. But Nina gave him none. The first day ended with murmurs among journalists and spectators. Edward has the upper hand. some whispered. She has no chance. But others, especially those who had watched Nina transform in the months since her fortune, leaned toward faith. She is stronger than she looks, one woman told a reporter. Don't underestimate her. Outside the courthouse, Edward gave interviews with the ease of a man basking in attention. Nina slipped quietly into her car, her Bible on her lap. She had no words for the press, but inside, she whispered one sentence to herself. The final word does not belong to man. The second week of the trial, Nina finally rose to testify. The courtroom hushed as she stepped into the witness box, her presence more commanding than diamonds. She began not with rehearsed lines, but with memory. She recounted the night Edward threw her out, her voice steady but threaded with emotion. She told of the suitcase, the insults, the 3 bills slapped on a table like a verdict. He did not give me money, she said firmly. He gave me humiliation. The room stirred. She reached into her bag and withdrew a small glass frame. Inside it lay the very $150, creased, preserved, evidence of both cruelty and redemption. Holding it up, she declared, "This insult became my seed. I turned it into freedom." Her words cut deeper than any lawyer's argument. Reporters scribbled furiously, cameras clicked, and Edward shifted uncomfortably in his seat. Clarissa's smile faltered. Nina went on, describing how she had once sold her late mother's jewelry to fund Edward's first project, how she had stood behind him when others doubted, how she had been mocked for her simplicity while he sought applause. "I was never unambitious," she concluded, her eyes fixed on the judge. "I simply dreamed in silence. And silence, Your Honor, is not emptiness. It is strength waiting for its time." When she stepped down, the gallery erupted in murmurs, many wiping their eyes. Edward felt the ground shift beneath him. For the first time, the narrative no longer belonged to him. The same silence he had despised had now become her weapon. He clenched his jaw, rage burning beneath his polished exterior. He had wanted Nina to be invisible, but she had made herself unforgettable. Weeks of arguments and rebuttals finally led to the day of judgment. The courthouse was packed, journalists buzzing like restless bees, their pens ready to carve history. Edward sat tall, trying to cloak his nerves with arrogance. Clarissa whispered assurances in his ear, though her eyes betrayed unease. Nina, however, bowed her head in prayer, lips moving silently until the judge entered. When the ruling began, the air thickened with anticipation. The judge's words were measured, deliberate. He acknowledged Edward's claim, but dismantled it piece by piece, pointing out that the money was thrown at Nina as a dismissal, not as a gift or investment. He noted her sacrifices during Edward's rise and declared that the winnings were hers alone. "This court rules in favor of the defendant," he announced. The $15 million remained the sole property of Mrs. Nina. Gasps rippled through the hall. Nina closed her eyes, a tear slipping free, while Edward's face stiffened into fury. Clarissa squeezed his hand, but he yanked it away. Outside, Nina was hailed as a symbol of resilience. Strangers called her a testimony, a proof that God uplifts the humble. Edward stormed into his car, giving no interviews this time. Though wealthy still, he felt stripped, humiliated. The thought of losing control over Nina gnawed at him more than losing the case. "This isn't over," he muttered, his pride already plotting new schemes. Nina, on the other hand, whispered, "Thank you, Lord," knowing battles were not just fought in court, but in the heart. Edward refused to accept defeat. Though the law was against him, he continued to torment Nina. Through veiled threats, relentless pressure, and manipulations whispered into the ears of mutual acquaintances. Exhausted, Nina eventually agreed to settle privately. A 50-50 split of her winnings, not out of fear, but out of a desperate longing for peace. Edward, triumphant, strutted into church with Clarissa on his arm, boasting of his regained power. In a gesture meant to sting Nina, he handed Clarissa his 50% share, proclaiming her the queen of his empire. For a while he basked in his illusion of control, convinced he had finally won. But greed has no loyalty. Within a year, Clarissa drained accounts, liquidated assets, and vanished with her childhood lover, leaving Edward betrayed, humiliated, and poorer than he had ever been in decades. Newspapers devoured the scandal. Millionaire mogul duped by mistress, runs away with millions. The same society that once clapped for him now laughed behind their hands. Edward spiraled in shame, his empire dented not by collapse, but by ridicule. For a man who lived on applause, ridicule was ruin enough. And so, like a dog returning to the door it once scorned, Edward came back to Nina. He arrived at her apartment one quiet evening, his arrogance stripped bare, his voice breaking as he begged forgiveness. "Let's move in together again, Nina," he pleaded. "Give me another chance. I have nothing without you." Nina stared at him, her heart a battlefield of memory and mercy. Part of her longed to send him away, to let him choke on the ashes of his pride. Yet another part remembered the years they had once shared, the prayers she had prayed for him even when he mocked her. She stood by the window, confused, torn between grace and justice. The story ended not with an answer, but with a question written in the air. Would Nina forgive him, or would she finally leave him to the destiny he had carved with his own hands? Please share, like, and subscribe. Your support means the world to us. Thank you for watching to the end. Don't forget to come back for more interesting tales.